Once again, I know it has been a very, very, very long time since this channel has been active. I've just been, extremely busy with university and that kind of thing. But I'm back. There's a lot of stuff I want to put out, a lot of stuff I have been working on already. So by the time I have to start the semester up again, I'm not just going to, abandon my channel again. This is, as the title says, this is going to be my second installment in that series on heaven that I started months ago by now. So I'll definitely link the first part in the description so you can either recap or, just have a good idea of what we'll be talking about here. So what we established in the last video was the very nature and definition of what heaven is. To recap a little bit, we understand the essence of heaven in and of itself, as we covered last time, as union with and knowledge of the very essence of God by a finite, rational creature. As we said in the introduction, we want to try to establish as much as we can by unaided reason. So what I want to do here is kind of give a philosophical, rational argument as to how we can know that there even is a last end or finality towards which mankind tends for his fulfillment. If we don't establish this, then we can't move on to the next step in establishing what the last end actually consists in, namely union with God, and what that means and the significance of what that means. Now, it isn't controversial, I don't think, to say that there are all sorts of ends and purposes for which we act in various ways. There is, in fact, no activity of any agent that is not ordered towards some goal or end state. This is because in any act of an agent, the outcome of that act is already present in potentiality, or else it would emerge from non-being, given the distinction between actuality and potentiality. If you want a rundown of that distinction, I think it's in my part 1 of the series on metaphysics that I've done, which I will, keep up on now that I'm back. Because of that distinction between actuality and potentiality, the effect or outcome of the agent that acts is inclined toward in its potentiality by the agent that is in act, since nothing reduces itself to actuality, since it would have to be in actuality in order to reduce itself to act, which is clearly absurd and impossible. So every agent that does act is inclined toward the actualization of some potency as an end state, towards which it is inclined to act. I go into this in much deeper depth in my Foundations of Christianity video, where I was discussing teleology. And I'll get into it even more in a future installment on the series on metaphysics that I'm currently working on. Now, for the rational nature, that is us, the question becomes, what are the ends that flow from our nature as a rational animal, as a rational creature? Is there one ultimate goal or purpose towards which we are all inclined to fulfill as rational animals? And how would we go about knowing it? St. Thomas, I think, is especially helpful here in distinguishing acts that he would term properly human acts and acts of a human being just in general. These aren't the same thing. To say that an act is a human act is to say that the act in question flows from what it intelligibly means to be a human being. For a Thomist, a human being is, by definition, as we've gone over before, none other than a rational animal. That is, a creature of an animal nature endowed with intellect and will. That is the human being as to its very essence. Thus, acts which flow from man's capacity, precisely as an animal nature endowed with intellect and will, are called human acts, properly speaking, and those acts which are simply performed by a human being may be, properly speaking, human acts, but they're not necessarily human acts, properly so called. For example, salivating, breathing, typically, the mere act of seeing, these things aren't, properly speaking, human acts because they don't proceed from the deliberate act of the will, flowing from an intellectual judgment. Making this video, reading, speaking, performing any action that flows from intellectual judgment and deliberate will, and therefore willed intention or end, these are properly called human acts. What makes them characteristically human is not their mere performance, but their performance as flowing from the rational soul, that is, from the capacity in man whereby he is a man, endowed with intellect and will. So, if we are going to ask if there is in man a final end or purpose, we are therefore necessarily asking about man as a rational and willing creature. Now, what differentiates human beings from non-rational animals is that for non-rational animals, they desire sensible goods and apprehend sensible knowledge of particular things for their own bodily, animal fulfillments. And the depth of this fulfillment is proportional to the depth of the corporeal objects themselves that they have to take in for their perfection. And this is because their being is entirely corporeal. So it follows that their fulfillments are necessarily corporeal. Since their fulfillments are necessarily corporeal, it follows that their fulfillments are always restricted to the domain of particulars, since particulars are always corporeal and material, because they're restricted to quantitative units of corporeal matter, whereas the immaterial is necessarily universal. It's not beholden to any particular unit of quantitative matter. Now, human beings, by contrast, not only are we able to, in accord with our animal nature, tend toward the fulfillment of corporeal needs and desires, since we are animal, but by virtue of the rational soul, which makes us characteristically human, we are also able to know and desire that which unites all truths and goods, precisely insofar as they are true and good. Now, what unites them together would be actuality, or being. Truth is being as sought after by the mind, and goodness is being as sought after by the will. For truth, this shouldn't really be controversial, because the mind is, or rather truth, is the mind's correspondence with reality, and reality is such inasmuch it is actual. So if the mind not only inclines toward knowing particular truths, but truth as such, it follows that actuality or being is the end of the intellect. As for goodness, I've made this argument several times on my channel before, but to recap, goodness cannot be understood apart from a thing being more or less perfect in some way. Hence, the measurability of goodness as better or worse. Perfection, as I've said before, cannot be understood apart from being or actuality. You can't have, for example, a perfect triangle unless it comports to its geometrical definition as a triangle. So the more a triangle is itself, the better it is. So the degree to which things are more or less perfect is going to determine the degree to which they are good. The human will, therefore, since it inclines toward the good itself, following the intellect's judgment, inclines toward the same reality that the intellect inclines toward, namely being or actuality, which is ultimately one end. Now, we're able to attain particular manifestations of this whenever we acquire some finite truth or some finite good, but precisely because our rational soul has as its object or end the transcendental source of truth and goodness as such, namely being itself. Whenever we recognize some finite good or some finite truth as finite, the mind of the will automatically incline towards whatever lies beyond that finite limitation. By nature, it cannot be satiated with one finite manifestation of truth or goodness. We all have this, experience of this, I'm sure. You can all attest to it. Whenever we attain some good or truth, we do enjoy it, but that enjoyment or satiation is exhaustive. And once exhausted, the mind of the will still incline further, because the real ultimate object of fulfillment simply can't be reduced to this or that particular manifestation of being, but can only rest in that which possesses the fullness of what the rational soul inclines toward, namely goodness and truth as such, which, as we went over before, is sourced in pure, unlimited actuality itself. Since our very nature is defined by our endowment with the rational soul, and since the rational soul is distinctive as the defining principle of what we are, it follows that whatever the rational soul, as such, ultimately inclines toward for its fulfillment or perfection, that is what the last end, or humanity as such, would consist in. And that's the basic argument for how we can know that there is an ultimate last end or goal or fulfillment for mankind. Now, in the next video, what we're going to do is we're going to go through, as St. Thomas does in the Summa, some potential candidates that one could try to offer for this final fulfillment, such as honor, wealth, power, pleasure, these kinds of things. St. Thomas goes on through each of them to demonstrate on philosophical grounds that the beatific vision of God alone is what would constitute man's last end. I know this video is probably a little dry since it was primarily to establish that mankind does incline toward one last end and the implications for what this means for man as a rational creature. But in the next one, we'll show why it is that only God alone in the beatific vision can fulfill this last end that we've been talking about. And then we'll get into describing the nature of the beatific vision itself, which will hopefully deepen our understanding of our need for God, and by extension, the futility of that which is not God. So thanks for watching. Sorry for the long hiatus. I should be adding more to the metaphysical series, more refutations of atheist arguments, maybe do some response videos. And also, I know a lot of you who follow me on Twitter know that I have a Curious Cat, in which I try to answer a lot of questions that you might have on the faith or Thomistic philosophy or things like that. So one thing I plan to do is grouping a bunch of those together and answering them on this channel in various videos. So look out for those as well. Subscribe if you like the channel. Follow me on Twitter. And I'll see you in the next one.